before we begin, I want to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Maybe it's late at night. Maybe everyone around you is already asleep. Whatever time it is, wherever you are, welcome to Nachtmare Witness. Now, let's get into tonight's story.
This is a true story that happened to me and my dad, and I need you to understand that before I tell it, because the things I saw that day still haunt me in ways I cannot fully explain. My dad lives at a town that is known for its festivals, a place where the streets fill with music and lights and crowds of people during the summer months, where the air smells like fried food and cotton candy, and the laughter of children echoes off the old brick buildings. It is a happy place, or it is supposed to be, a place where families go to make memories and take photos and forget about the darkness that exists in the world. But every place has its shadows. Every town has its secrets. And sometimes the things that hide in the quiet spaces are worse than anything you will find in a crowded street. We took the Miles Fields that day, me and my dad, walking through the countryside that stretched behind the festival grounds like a forgotten world. The fields were supposed to be beautiful, rolling hills of green and gold that caught the afternoon light and made you feel like you were walking through a painting. My dad knew the area well, had grown up exploring these paths when he was a boy, and he wanted to show me the parts of his childhood that the tourists never saw. We had packed sandwiches and water bottles, dressed in old clothes that could handle the dirt and the dust, and set out with the easy confidence of people who thought they knew what they were getting into. We decided to go through the bushes instead of staying on the main path. That was my idea, or at least I think it was. I remember pointing at a gap in the hedgerow, a narrow opening where the branches had been pushed aside by animals or weather or the passage of time, and saying something about shortcuts and adventure. My dad hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the gap. But then he smiled that easy smile of his and nodded. He was always up for an adventure, my dad, always willing to push past the boundaries that other people accepted without question. It was one of the things I loved about him, and one of the things that scared me most on that day. The bushes were thicker than they looked from the outside, branches catching on our clothes and scratching at our arms, leaves brushing against our faces with a softness that felt almost deliberate, like hands trying to slow us down or guide us back. The light changed as we pushed deeper, filtering through the canopy in thin beams that danced and shifted with every breeze. It was cooler in there, damp, the air smelling of earth and rot, and something else I could not identify, something metallic and sharp that made my nose wrinkle. I told myself it was just the smell of the forest, just the natural decay of leaves and wood and small animals that had died and been absorbed back into the ground. But part of me knew, even then, that the smell was wrong, that it did not belong in a place like this. I saw the motorbike first. It was sitting in the middle of a small clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean away from it, as if the forest itself was trying to create distance between itself and whatever the bike represented. It was an old model, rusted in places, the chrome dulled by weather and time, but it was not so old that it looked like it had been abandoned for years. It looked recent, deliberate, placed there with purpose rather than left behind by accident. The kickstand was down, the wheels were straight, the handlebars were turned slightly to the left as if the rider had stopped, gotten off, and walked away without looking back. But no one walks away from a motorbike in the middle of a forest and leaves it perfectly positioned like that. No one does that unless they had no choice. I do not know if it was red paint or blood. That is the question that has eaten at me for years, the thing I still want to know with a desperation that keeps me awake some nights. The bike was covered in red, thick and dripping, running down the fuel tank, and the seat and the engine in slow rivulets that caught the light and gleamed like wet skin. It was too bright for rust, too fresh for old damage, too deliberate for an accident. The red covered everything, pooling in the crevices of the metal, dripping onto the ground beneath the bike, where it had formed a dark patch in the dirt. It looked real. That is the only way I can describe it. It looked like something that had been alive, something that had been inside a body, something that had been spilled with force and intention. But then the paint effect looked so real that I started to doubt my own eyes. I had seen horror movies, had played video games with fake blood and gore, had walked through haunted houses at Halloween where the walls were splattered with red that looked convincing from a distance but revealed itself as corn syrup and food coloring up close. I told myself this was the same, that someone had dumped an old bike in the forest and decided to make it look creepy, that the red was paint, carefully applied, designed to shock whoever stumbled across it. People did things like that, especially near festival towns, where the locals got bored and the tourists got curious. It was a prank, a joke, a piece of installation art left in the woods for the sake of a story. But the way it was dripping made my stomach turn. Paint does not drip like that, not unless it is still wet, still fresh, still being applied. And this red had been dripping for a while, long enough to form a puddle beneath the bike, long enough to soak into the ground and turn the dirt black. The drips were not uniform, not the steady run of gravity pulling liquid down a smooth surface. They were irregular, thick in some places, thin in others, as if they had come from multiple sources, multiple wounds, multiple points of impact. I stepped closer, against my better judgment, against the voice in my head that was screaming at me to run, and I saw that the red had splattered across the leaves of nearby bushes, across the bark of a tree, across a rock that sat half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had sprayed, like it had been thrown, like it had erupted from something with force. And then I saw the black cover. It was draped over the back of the bike, over the seat and the rear fender, a heavy tarp that had been pulled tight and tucked in at the edges. It was not a motorcycle cover, not the kind you buy at a store to protect your bike from rain. It was something else, something thicker, something that looked like it had been scavenged from a construction site or a farm. The way it was positioned, the way it had been arranged with such care, made my blood run cold. There could have been a dead body there. That was the thought that hit me like a physical blow. The thought that made my legs start shaking and my vision start to blur. The cover was shaped wrong, bulging in places where a bike seat should be flat, draping over something that had the rough outline of a human form. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my feet rooted to the ground, my eyes locked on that black cover and the red that seeped out from beneath its edges. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and too loud, and the distant hum of the festival that might as well have been in another country. I thought about pulling the cover back, about confirming what I already knew in my gut, about seeing what was hidden underneath. But I could not move my hands. I could not make myself reach out and touch that tarp, could not risk seeing what I might find, could not bear the weight of that knowledge for the rest of my life. So I ran. I turned and I ran, my feet pounding against the dirt, branches whipping against my face, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. I did not look back. I did not call out to my dad. I just ran, driven by a terror that was older than thought, older than reason, the kind of terror that animals feel when they sense a predator nearby. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I burst through the edge of the bushes and stumbled into the open field beyond. The sunlight hit me like a slap, bright and warm and ordinary, and I fell to my knees in the grass, gasping, my whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. My dad followed me. He must have seen me run, must have heard the panic in my movement, because he was right behind me, emerging from the bushes with his face pale and his eyes wide. He did not ask what I had seen. He just grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet, and we walked back toward the town, without speaking, without looking back, without ever mentioning the clearing, or the bike, or the red that might have been paint, or might have been blood. We did not call the police, we did not tell anyone. We just went home, washed our clothes, ate dinner in silence, and pretended that the day had been normal. To this day, I still want to know if it was blood or a really cool paint effect. That question has become an obsession for me, a loop that plays in my mind whenever I have a quiet moment, whenever the darkness presses close and my imagination starts to wander. I have searched online for stories about that area, for news reports of missing people or discovered bodies or abandoned bikes in the forest. I have found nothing, which should comfort me, but does not. The absence of information is not the same as proof of innocence. Someone could have died in that clearing, could have been killed and left under that black cover, and the body could have been moved before anyone thought to look. The red could have been washed away by rain, the bike could have been claimed by whoever left it, the evidence could have dissolved into the earth like it had never existed. Or it could have been a prank. A group of teenagers, bored on a Saturday night, stealing an old bike from a junkyard and painting it red, leaving it in the woods to scare whoever found it. The black cover could have been stuffed with leaves or branches, shaped to look like a body from a distance, designed to make someone like me run screaming back to town. The silence of the forest could have been coincidence, the damp smell just the natural rot of the woods, the metallic tang my imagination adding details to a scene that was already creepy enough. I want to believe this version. I have tried to believe it for years, have repeated it to myself like a mantra whenever the memory surfaces and my hands start to shake. But I cannot fully convince myself, because I remember the way the red caught the light, the way it looked wet even in the dry air of the forest, the way it had formed patterns that looked like handprints on the fuel tank. I remember the shape under the black cover, the way it had seemed to shift slightly when the wind moved through the clearing, as if whatever was beneath it was not fully still. I remember the silence, the absolute dead silence of the forest, the way every living thing had seemed to flee from that spot, leaving only the bike and the red and the black cover and me, standing there with my heart in my throat and my sanity hanging by a thread. My dad has never talked about it. I have asked him, once or twice, in the years since that day, what he saw when he followed me out of the bushes, whether he looked at the bike before he ran, whether he noticed the same details that burned themselves into my memory. He just shakes his head and changes the subject, his face going hard in a way that tells me he saw something too, something he does not want to describe, something he has locked away in the same part of his mind where he keeps all the other things that are too dark to share. We have an unspoken agreement, me and my dad, a pact of silence about that day in the Miles fields, about the bushes and the clearing and the motorbike that sat in the middle of the forest like a monument to something terrible. I still go back to that town sometimes, during the festivals, when the streets are full of light and music and the smell of fried food. I walk through the crowds with a smile on my face, buying cotton candy for my own children, pointing at the rides and the games, pretending that I am just another father making memories on a summer afternoon. But part of me is always looking toward the edge of town, toward the fields that stretch into the distance, toward the bushes that hide the path to the clearing. Part of me is always wondering if the bike is still there, if the red has faded, or if it has been refreshed, if the black cover still bulges, with its terrible secret, or if it has been removed, the evidence destroyed. The story ended before it could begin. I have never gone back to look. I have stood at the edge of the field, my feet pointing toward the gap in the hedgerow, my heart pounding with the same terror I felt that day, and I have turned away every time. Because what if it is still there? What if the red is still wet, still dripping, still waiting for someone to come close enough to see what it really is? What if the black cover has been pulled back, and what is underneath is worse than anything I imagined, worse than any body, any blood, any horror that my mind could conjure? What if the clearing is not a clearing at all, but a place where something lives, something that feeds on curiosity, something that lures people in with questions and keeps them there with answers they were never meant to find? Or what if it is gone? What if I go back and find nothing but grass and trees and the ordinary silence of the woods, and I am left with the knowledge that I will never know, that the question will remain unanswered forever, that the rest of my life will be spent wondering whether I ran from a murder scene or a prank, from a dead body or a pile of leaves, from real danger or the clever trick of bored teenagers? That uncertainty might be worse than any answer. At least if I found the bike again, if I saw the red and the cover and the shape beneath it, I could make a choice. I could pull back the cover and know, one way or the other, whether my fear was justified or foolish. But the not knowing, the endless maybe, the constant swinging between terror and relief, that is what eats at me. I have dreams about it sometimes. In the dreams, I am standing in the clearing again, but the bike is different. It is newer, cleaner, the red brighter and more vivid than I remember. The black cover is gone, and in its place is a figure sitting on the seat facing away from me. I cannot see its face, but I know it is waiting for me, has been waiting since that day in the forest, waiting for me to come back and finish what I started. I walk toward it, my feet moving against my will, my voice frozen in my throat. The figure turns, and I wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart racing, the image already fading, but the terror lingering like a stain. My dad is getting older now. His hair has gone gray, his steps have slowed, and the easy smile that used to define him comes less frequently. I wonder sometimes if he thinks about that day, if the memory surfaces when he is alone in his house, if the question of blood or paint haunts him the way it haunts me. I wonder if he regrets not calling the police, not investigating further, not doing something that would have given us both closure. Or maybe he knows something I do not, something he saw in the clearing that day that told him the truth, that confirmed his worst fears, that made him decide silence was the only safe option. Maybe he is protecting me, has been protecting me all these years, by keeping whatever he knows locked away in the dark corners of his memory. To this day, I still want to know. I want to know if someone died in that clearing, if a life was ended and a body was hidden under a black cover on the back of a motorbike. I want to know if the red was blood, human blood, spilled in violence and left to dry in the sun. I want to know if I ran from a crime scene, if my cowardice allowed a killer to escape, if my silence cost someone justice. Or I want to know if it was paint, clever and cruel, designed to make fools of people like me, to turn a walk in the woods into a lifetime of nightmares. I want to know if I was tricked, if my fear was manufactured, if the terror I felt was just the result of good staging and bad luck. But most of all, I want to know why the forest was so silent, why the birds stopped singing, why the insects stopped buzzing, why the whole world seemed to hold its breath while I stood in that clearing and stared at the red and the black and the shape that might have been a body. Because silence like that does not come from paint. Silence like that comes from death, from the absence of life, from the presence of something so wrong that even the animals know to flee. And if the silence was real, if the forest itself was afraid, then whatever was on that bike was not a prank. It was something else, something worse, something that I was never meant to see and will never be able to forget. I still go to the festival town. I still walk through the Miles fields, though I stay on the main path now, never venturing into the bushes, never looking for gaps in the hedgerow, never following my curiosity into the dark. I tell myself I am being careful, that I have learned my lesson, that some questions are better left unasked. But the truth is, I am afraid. I am afraid of what I might find if I go back, afraid of what I might not find, afraid that the answer to my question will change me in ways I cannot predict. So I walk the safe paths, I smile at the crowds, I buy cotton candy for my children, and I pretend that the world is simple and clean and free of the things that hide in the shadows of the forest. But at night, when the house is quiet and my family is asleep, I lie in bed and I listen. I listen for the sound of a motorbike engine in the distance, for the drip of something wet against the pavement, for the rustle of a black cover being pulled back. And sometimes, in the space between heartbeats, I think I hear it. I think I hear the forest calling me back, the clearing waiting for my return, the question demanding its answer. And I wonder, as I stare at the ceiling in the dark, whether someday I will be strong enough to go back, to pull back that cover, to know once and for all whether it was blood or paint, whether I ran from death or from a joke, whether the terror I felt was real or just the product of a mind that wanted to be scared. I do not know if that day will ever come. I do not know if I want it to. What I do know is that the motorbike is still out there, somewhere in the Miles fields, somewhere in the bushes, somewhere in the clearing where the forest goes silent and the red catches the light like wet skin. It is waiting. It has always been waiting. And someday, when the curiosity becomes too much to bear, when the not knowing becomes worse than any truth, I will go back. I will walk through the bushes, I will find the clearing, and I will see what is under the black cover. And whatever I find, whether it is blood or paint or something I have not yet imagined, I will finally have my answer. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to let me sleep. Not that long ago, a man killed his wife and children in a way that still makes people in our town whisper when they pass the house, still makes parents hold their children tighter at night, still makes the old-timers shake their heads and say they saw it coming, though none of them ever did anything to stop it. It was the kind of crime that tears a hole in a community, the kind that does not heal with time but just scabs over, waiting to be picked at by anyone who gets too curious. I was young when it happened, old enough to understand death, but too young to understand why someone would bring it to their own family. And the memory of that time sits in my chest like a stone that never gets lighter, no matter how many years pass. The man had lost his job. That was what people said afterward, as if losing a paycheck could explain drowning your own children and shooting the woman you had promised to love forever. He had worked at the factory on the edge of town for 15 years, a steady job that paid enough for a modest house and a used car and groceries on the table. But the factory closed without warning, the owners packing up overnight and leaving hundreds of people without work, without warning, without a plan. The man was one of them, middle-aged and unskilled, with a resume that listed only one employer and a family that depended on him for everything. He went home that last day and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, while his wife made dinner and his children played in the next room, unaware that their world was about to end. What happened next is something I have pieced together from newspaper clippings and overheard conversations, and the fragments that the first responders shared in the weeks after, when they were still too shaken to keep it all inside. The man waited until the children were asleep. He went into the bathroom and filled the tub with water, the old clawfoot tub that took forever to fill, that groaned and rattled when the hot water ran. One by one, he carried his children from their beds, 3 of them, ages 6, 4, and 2, and he held them under the water until they stopped moving. The report said there were no signs of struggle, no bruises on their arms, no scratches on his face. The children must have been confused, must have thought it was a game, must have looked up at their father with trusting eyes until the water closed over their faces and the world went dark. He put them all in bed after that. Not the tub, not the floor, not some corner where they could be found quickly. He dried their hair with a towel, combed it neat, dressed them in their pajamas, and tucked them under their blankets as if they were just sleeping, as if morning would come and they would wake up and ask for pancakes and cartoons. He even fluffed their pillows, adjusted their stuffed animals, kissed their cold foreheads. Then he went to the master bedroom, where his wife was reading a book, waiting for him to come to bed, and he shot her in the head with a gun he had bought years ago and never told her about. She did not have time to scream, did not have time to ask why, did not have time to do anything but fall backward onto the mattress, with her book still open on the nightstand. After that, he set the house on fire. He used gasoline from the garage, the can he kept for the lawnmower, and he walked through the halls, splashing it on the walls, the floors, the furniture, the curtains his wife had picked out to make the living room feel bright. He started in the kitchen, dropping a match onto the pooled fuel, and he watched the flames crawl up the cabinets and across the ceiling before he went back to the master bedroom, lay down beside his dead wife, and waited for the smoke to take him too. But the fire did not cooperate. It spread faster than he expected, faster than the old house could contain, and the smoke detectors screamed into the night, waking the neighbors, drawing attention, ruining his plan for a quiet exit from a world that had rejected him. When the neighbor saw the house on fire, he did not hesitate. He was a man named Mr. Henderson, a retired mechanic who lived next door with his wife and their yappy little dog, a man who fixed bicycles for the neighborhood kids and told jokes at the block parties and always had a smile that made you feel like the world was a little kinder than it actually was. He saw the orange glow through his bedroom window, smelled the smoke before the alarms even reached his ears, and he ran out of his house in his slippers and his robe, barefoot on the cold pavement, shouting for someone to call the fire department. But he did not wait for help. He ran straight into the burning house, because he knew there were children inside, because he had seen them playing in the yard that very afternoon, because he was the kind of man who could not stand by while a family burned. He found them all dead. That was the part that broke him, the part that changed him, the part that turned the happy, funny guy into someone who sat on his porch for hours without speaking, who flinched when children laughed, who eventually moved away without saying goodbye to anyone. Mr. Henderson had expected to find the family asleep, confused by the smoke, easy to carry out to safety. Instead, he found them tucked in their beds, soaking wet from being drowned in the tub, their skin pale and waxy, their hair still damp against their pillows. The water had soaked through the sheets, through the mattresses, pooling on the floorboards in puddles that reflected the firelight like mirrors. He touched the youngest one, the 2-year-old, hoping against hope that the wetness was from the fire hoses, from burst pipes, from some explanation that did not involve a father drowning his own baby. But the child was cold, too cold, and the water in her hair was not from any fire. The man had drowned all their children and shot the wife after losing his job. That was the headline, the summary. the easy version that fit in a newspaper column and let people shake their heads and turn the page. But Mr. Henderson saw the reality, saw the careful way the children had been arranged, saw the peaceful expressions on their faces that did not match the horror of their deaths, saw the water dripping from their clothes onto the floor, drop by drop, in a rhythm that sounded like a clock ticking down to nothing. He carried the 6-year-old out first, cradling the body like a sleeping child, his face blank, his eyes empty. The firefighters found him standing in the front yard, the dead boy in his arms, staring at the flames that were consuming the house he had tried to save, and he did not respond when they spoke to him. He just stood there, dripping with water that was not his own, while the fire roared behind him and the night filled with sirens. It had a huge impact on the first responders and the neighbor. I remember Mr. Henderson being this really happy, funny guy, the kind of person who could make a room light up just by walking into it. He told stories at the diner, helped people jump-start their cars in winter, organized the neighborhood cookouts every 4th of July. He was the kind of neighbor everyone wanted, the kind of friend everyone needed, the kind of man who made you believe that people were fundamentally good. And then, overnight, that person was gone. It was not a gradual change, not a slow fading of his spirit over months of grief. It was immediate, total, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off the part of him that knew how to smile. He stopped going to the diner. He stopped fixing bicycles. He stopped answering his door when the neighborhood kids knocked, asking if he wanted to play catch or see their new scooters. His wife tried to help, tried to get him to talk, tried to take him to a doctor or a counselor or a priest, but he just sat in his chair by the window, looking at the charred remains of the house next door. His hands folded in his lap, his face a mask of something that was not quite sadness and not quite horror, but some combination of both that had no name. He moved away 6 months later, selling his house at a loss, leaving in the middle of the night without telling anyone where he was going. I heard he died a few years after that, alone in a small apartment in another state. And I sometimes wonder if he ever stopped seeing those wet children, if they followed him in his dreams, if the dripping sound of water was the last thing he heard before the end. The house sat empty for a long time after the fire. The damage was extensive, but not total. The frame still solid, the foundation uncracked, the bones of the building intact beneath the blackened skin. The insurance company paid out, the bank took possession, and the town waited for someone to buy it, to tear it down, to erase the stain that had been left on our street. But no one wanted to demolish a house that could be repaired. No one wanted to spend money on destruction when construction was cheaper. And eventually, the bank found a buyer. A family from out of state, people who did not know the history, who saw only the low price and the potential, who thought they were getting a bargain on a charming fixer-upper in a quiet town. They moved in, painted the walls, replaced the burned cabinets, hung curtains that were almost identical to the ones the dead wife had chosen, and tried to make a home. They did not stay long. None of them ever did. When my sister was in high school, a girl moved into our town from out of state. She was the daughter of the new family, a quiet teenager with long brown hair and nervous eyes, who sat alone at lunch and jumped when people spoke too loudly near her. My sister was kind, the kind of person who befriended the new kids because she remembered what it felt like to be invisible. And she started eating lunch with this girl, walking with her between classes, inviting her to hang out after school. It took a few weeks for the girl to open up, to trust that my sister was not mocking her, to share the things that were keeping her awake at night. And when she finally did, the things she said made my sister's blood run cold. She lived in that house for a few weeks before she started telling my sister about the wet ghost girl and the wet kids that were in her room. She said they would appear at night, after she turned off her light, materializing from the corners of the room like condensation forming on a window. They were children, 3 of them, plus a woman who stood behind them with hollow eyes and a dark stain on the side of her head. The girl said they were wet, always wet, their clothes dripping water onto the floor, their hair plastered to their faces, their skin pale and wrinkled like they had been in the bath too long. They would sit on the bed, she said, their small bodies making damp impressions on her comforter, or they would stand by the window and drip on the floor, the sound of water hitting wood like a slow, steady rain that never stopped. She said they did not speak, did not move much, did not try to touch her or harm her in any visible way, but their presence was unbearable, a weight of sadness and wrongness that pressed down on her chest until she could not breathe. She could smell the water on them, a stale chlorine smell mixed with something else, something organic and rotting, like pond water that had been sitting too long in the sun. She could feel the cold radiating from their bodies, turning her room into a freezer even in the middle of summer, even with the heater running full blast. She would pull the covers over her head and pray for morning, but she could still hear them, still smell them, still feel the mattress sag as one of them sat down beside her. She said the wet ghost girl was the worst. The oldest child, the 6-year-old, who would crawl onto the bed and sit cross-legged at the foot, staring at the girl with eyes that were not quite empty, but filled with a question that had no answer. Why, those eyes seemed to ask. Why did he do this to us? Why did no one come sooner? Why are you here in our house, sleeping in our beds, living the life that was stolen from us? The girl would cry under her covers, silent tears streaming down her face, too terrified to scream, too paralyzed to run. She said the wet ghost girl would tilt her head, the way children do when they are curious, and water would run from her hair onto the bedspread, forming a dark patch that would still be damp in the morning, still cold to the touch, still smelling of that terrible chlorine and rot. She was terrified people would think she was crazy. That was why she had not told her parents, why she had not told the school counselor, why she had waited weeks before whispering the truth to my sister in the library during lunch, her voice shaking, her hands gripping the table as if she were afraid of floating away. She said she had tried to convince herself it was nightmares, that the stress of moving had caused her imagination to run wild, that the stories she had heard about the house were influencing her dreams. But she could not explain the damp sheets, the cold spots on the floor, the way her cat refused to enter her room after dark, hissing and arching his back at something she could not see. She could not explain the sound of water dripping in a room with no leaks, the feeling of small fingers pressing against her legs through the blankets, the whispered word "daddy" that echoed in her ears when she was alone. She also just could not stay in the house. That was the final truth, the breaking point, the reason she had confided in my sister at all. She had tried, for the sake of her parents, for the sake of normalcy, for the sake of not being the crazy new girl who saw ghosts. She had endured night after night of the dripping and the sitting and the staring, had endured the cold and the smell and the weight of those hollow eyes. But one night, the wet ghost girl had reached out and touched her hand. The touch was ice, was water, was death, and the girl had screamed, finally screamed, loud enough to wake her parents, loud enough to bring her father running with a baseball bat, loud enough to shatter the silence she had been keeping for weeks. She told them everything that night, sobbing, hysterical, begging them to leave, to pack their bags, to never set foot in that house again. They did not stay in the house long after that. Her parents, skeptical and confused, but unable to deny the terror in their daughter's eyes, found an apartment across town and moved within the week. They lost their deposit, lost the money they had spent on repairs, lost the dream of a fresh start in a new town. But they gained something too, something they could not articulate, but both felt the moment they stepped out of that house for the last time. The air was lighter, the sun was brighter. The weight that had been pressing on their shoulders since they moved in was suddenly gone. The daughter stopped seeing the wet children, stopped hearing the dripping, stopped waking up with damp sheets and frozen fingers. She transferred to another school, made new friends, grew into a woman who rarely spoke of that time but never forgot it. Nor did the next family to move in. The house went back on the market, the bank desperate to unload it, the price dropping lower and lower until another family took the bait. They were locals, people who knew the history but convinced themselves that tragedy did not linger, that ghosts were not real, that a fresh coat of paint and new furniture could erase the past. They had 2 children of their own, boys who were excited about the big yard and the treehouse in the back, and they moved in with the same optimism that every family brings to a new home. They lasted 3 months. The father would not say what happened, would not explain why he packed his family up in the middle of the night and drove to his mother's house 2 states away. But the rumor spread, as rumors do in small towns, that he had found his sons sleepwalking toward the bathroom, that they had been found standing in the tub fully clothed, that they woke up screaming about the wet kids who wanted to play, who wanted to hold their hands, who wanted to take them somewhere dark and cold and deep. The house sits empty now, as for years, the lawn overgrown, the windows boarded up, the for sale sign faded and tilted in the front yard. No one will buy it. No one will rent it. The bank has stopped trying, and the town has stopped caring, and the house has become just another part of the landscape, a dark shape that children dare each other to approach on Halloween, a cautionary tale that parents tell their kids when they want them to behave. But the stories persist, passed down from one generation to the next, growing and shifting with each telling until no one knows what is true and what is legend anymore. I drive past it sometimes, on my way to the grocery store or the post office, and I slow down without meaning to, my eyes drawn to the second-floor window that used to be the children's bedroom. I imagine I can see shapes behind the boards, small silhouettes pressed against the glass, their hands leaving wet prints that evaporate before anyone can photograph them. I imagine I can hear the dripping, faint but steady, the sound of water that has nowhere to go, that keeps falling and falling and falling, because it cannot stop, because it is trapped in a loop of its own death, replaying the final moments over and over until someone finally listens, finally understands, finally does something to set them free. But I never stop. I never get out of my car, never walk up to the door, never pull back the boards and look inside, because I am afraid, not of the ghosts, not of the wet children or the hollow-eyed woman, but of what I might feel if I stood in that room and the air went cold and the dripping started and a small voice whispered why in my ear. I am afraid that I would understand, that the weight of their sadness would crush me the way it crushed Mr. Henderson, that I would become another person who saw too much and could never unsee it, another happy funny guy who disappeared overnight and was never quite the same again. My sister still talks to that girl sometimes, the one who saw the wet ghost girl, the one who touched death and lived to tell about it. She is married now, has children of her own, lives in a house far from any tragedy, far from any history, far from the dripping and the cold. But my sister says she still sleeps with a nightlight, still checks her children's breathing 3 times a night, still flinches when she hears water running in the pipes. She says the girl told her in their last conversation that she sometimes sees them still, not in her house, but in her dreams, standing at the foot of her bed, dripping, staring, asking their silent question. She says she has learned to live with it, to accept that some things do not go away just because you move, just because you pray, just because you want them to. The house is still there, waiting. The wet children are still there, dripping, and somewhere, in the back of my mind, in the place where fear and curiosity meet, I know that someday someone will buy that house again. Someone who does not know. Someone who thinks the past is just a story. They will move in, they will paint the walls, they will hang their curtains, and they will try to sleep. And in the dark, in the cold, in the silence that is not quite silence, they will hear it. The drip, the drip, the drip of water that should not be there, falling from small fingers, from wet hair, from eyes that ask why and will never stop asking until the whole world drowns in the answer. A few years ago, I was walking through the woods off the beaten track a bit, just wandering really, with no particular destination in mind. It was one of those autumn afternoons where the light turns golden and everything feels softer than it should, like the world is wrapped in a blanket that muffles the sharp edges of reality. I had the day off work, nothing pressing to do, no one waiting for me at home, so I had driven out to the forest on the edge of town, parked my car at the main trailhead, and set off walking. The main paths were crowded with families and dog walkers and joggers with their headphones in, so I did what I always do when I want to be alone. I stepped off the trail, pushed through a gap in the bushes, and let the forest swallow me whole. I had been walking for maybe an hour, maybe two. Time moves differently when you are alone in the woods, when every step crunches on fallen leaves and every breath fills your lungs with the smell of earth and decay and life. I was following a deer trail, a narrow path through the undergrowth that only animals use, winding between trees that grew thicker and older the deeper I went. The sounds of the main trail had faded long ago, replaced by the rustle of small animals in the brush, the creak of branches in the breeze, the occasional call of a crow somewhere high above. I felt peaceful, disconnected from everything, free in a way that only solitude in nature can provide. That feeling would not last. That was when I smelt this really overpowering sweet smell. It hit me suddenly, cutting through the clean forest air like a knife through silk, so thick and cloying that I could almost taste it on my tongue. It was not the sweet of flowers or fruit or honey, not the pleasant sweetness of a bakery or a garden in spring. This was something else, something heavier, something that made my stomach twist even before my brain had processed what it might be. It smelled like rotting meat left in the sun, like sugar that has fermented into something poisonous, like a dessert that has been sitting out for weeks, growing mold and attracting flies. It was the sweetness of decay, the perfume of death, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to walk away, to pretend I had never smelled it at all. But I was nosy. That has always been my problem, this terrible curiosity that pulls me toward things I should avoid. That makes me peek through keyholes and read other people's messages and open doors that are better left closed. I told myself it was probably a dead animal, a deer that had been hit by a car and crawled into the woods to die, or a raccoon that had lost a fight with a predator. I told myself I would just look, just confirm what it was, just satisfy my curiosity, and then leave. I pulled back the undergrowth to have a look, my hands pushing aside branches and ferns and the thick vines that seemed to grow more densely in this spot than anywhere else in the forest. The smell got stronger, so strong that my eyes watered and my throat closed up, and then I saw him. I found a dead body. The guy had clearly been there a while and was not looking great, all swollen and green and black with various runny bits. He was lying on his back in a small clearing, his arms spread wide like he had been making snow angels in the dirt. His legs twisted at an angle that suggested he had fallen rather than laid himself down. His face was turned toward the sky, or what would have been his face. because the features were so bloated and distorted that he looked almost like a different species, something that had never been human. His skin was the color of old bruises, purple and green and yellow, stretched tight over swelling that had pushed his eyes halfway out of their sockets. His mouth was open, a dark hole that seemed to go on forever, and his tongue, thick and black, protruded between teeth that looked too white against the rot of his gums. The local wildlife had also been dining well for a few days. That was the detail that stuck with me, that haunts me still, that appears in my dreams with a clarity that makes me wake up gagging. His stomach had been opened, not by a knife, but by the beaks and teeth of the forest creatures that had found him before I did. I could see things that no one should ever see. Organs that had been pulled out and scattered around the clearing like discarded food, ribs that gleamed white where the flesh had been stripped away, a hand that ended in bones because the fingers had been carried off by something hungry. Flies buzzed in a cloud so thick it looked like smoke, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched my own panicked breathing. Maggots writhed in the wounds, thousands of them, a living carpet that moved and pulsed with a hunger of its own. I stumbled backward, my hand over my mouth, my stomach heaving, my vision swimming with spots of light and dark. I tripped over a root and fell hard on my backside, the impact knocking the breath out of me. And I sat there in the dirt, staring at the body, unable to look away and unable to keep looking. My phone was in my pocket, and it took 3 tries to get it out because my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I called the police, my voice cracking, my words tumbling over each other, telling them I had found a body in the woods, that I did not know who he was, that he had been dead for days at least, maybe longer. The dispatcher was calm, professional, asking me questions I could barely answer, telling me to stay where I was, to not touch anything, to wait for them to arrive. The police told me to wait with the body until they arrived. I wanted to argue, wanted to beg them to let me leave, to meet them at the trailhead, to go anywhere but back to that clearing, with that smell and those flies and that terrible swollen face. But I understood why they needed me there. I was the only one who knew the location, the only one who could guide them through the maze of deer trails and undergrowth to this hidden spot where a man had died alone and been consumed by the forest. So I stayed. I walked back to the clearing, each step feeling like I was walking through syrup, my legs heavy and uncooperative, and I sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet from the body, close enough to keep him in sight, far enough that the flies did not swarm me too badly. Being in the middle of nowhere, it took a while for them to arrive. The sun was already low when I found him, that golden afternoon light turning orange and then red as it filtered through the trees. I sat on that log and watched the light change, watched the shadows grow longer and deeper, watched the forest transform from a place of peace into a place of darkness. The temperature dropped as the sun went down, the autumn chill settling into my bones, and I wrapped my arms around myself and tried not to think about the thing lying in the clearing behind me. I could hear the sounds of the forest changing too, the daytime birds giving way to night creatures, the rustle of nocturnal animals beginning their hunt, the hoot of an owl somewhere close enough to make me jump. And it got dark, not the darkness of a city street, where streetlights and house lights and car headlights push back the night into manageable corners. This was total darkness, the kind that exists only in deep woods on moonless nights, where the canopy blocks out the stars and the air itself seems to absorb any light that dares to penetrate. I had a small flashlight on my phone, but I was afraid to use it, afraid that the beam would illuminate things I did not want to see, that it would catch the body in its glow and show me how much worse he looked in the artificial light. that it would attract the attention of whatever animals were still feeding nearby. So I sat in the dark, my eyes gradually adjusting until I could see the vague shapes of trees and rocks, and, worst of all, the pale mound of the body in the clearing, somehow visible even without light, as if he were glowing with his own terrible luminescence. I was just sat there in the dark with him for a long time. Hours, maybe, though time had stopped meaning anything. I tried to pray, though I had not been to church in years, tried to think about anything else, tried to remember songs and poems and the names of every teacher I had ever had. But my mind kept circling back to him, to the body, to the smell that had faded slightly in the cold but was still there, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin, becoming part of me. I could hear things in the darkness, things that were probably just animals, but that my imagination turned into something else. The crunch of leaves that sounded like footsteps approaching. The snap of a twig that sounded like a finger breaking. The soft, wet sound of something moving in the clearing, something feeding, something that had returned now that the human intruder was still and silent. I did not turn around. I could not turn around. I sat on that log, frozen, my eyes fixed on a point in the darkness where I knew he lay, and I waited. I waited for the sound of sirens, for the flash of police lights, for the voices of living humans to break the spell that the forest had cast over me. But the forest was patient, and the night was long, and the body behind me was dead, but somehow not silent, not gone, not finished with me yet. I felt him there, felt his presence like a weight pressing against my back, felt his empty eyes staring at me through the darkness, felt his anger at being found, at being seen, at being dragged from his private death into the light of someone else's curiosity. It turned out he had committed suicide. The police told me later, after they had finally arrived with their flashlights and their cameras and their yellow tape, after they had photographed the body and bagged the evidence and called the coroner to make the long drive from the city. He had been missing for 11 days, a middle-aged man with a history of depression, a wife who had left him, children who would not return his calls. He had walked into these woods with a bottle of pills and a bottle of whiskey, had found this clearing, had laid himself down and swallowed everything he had brought with him. He had chosen this spot deliberately, the police said, had pushed through the undergrowth the same way I had wanted to die alone and undisturbed, wanted the forest to claim him and erase him from the world. For a long time afterwards, I had dreams about him. They started about a week after I found the body, after the police had finished their questions and the news reports had faded and life had supposedly returned to normal. I would go to bed exhausted, my body craving sleep, my mind desperate for rest, and I would fall into darkness only to find him waiting for me. The dreams were always the same, at least at first. I would be back in the forest, back in that clearing, sitting on that same fallen log, but the body would be different. He would be sitting up, his swollen face turned toward me, his blackened eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. He would not move, would not speak, would just sit there and stare, and I would wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Then he started talking to me. It began with whispers, so faint I could barely make out the words, his swollen lips moving without sound, his black tongue flicking behind teeth that were too white. But gradually, over weeks and months, the words became clearer, became louder, became impossible to ignore. He would talk to me about how he was angry I had disturbed his resting place. That was his phrase, his accusation, the thing he repeated in every dream like a mantra, like a curse. "You disturbed my resting place," he would say, his voice wet and gurgling, as if he were speaking through water or through the rot that had consumed his throat. You should not have looked. You should not have found me. You should have let me be. He wanted me to kill myself. That was the thing he said that cut deepest, that woke me screaming, that made me afraid to close my eyes at night. He would describe it to me in detail, the way he had done it, the pills and the whiskey and the slow fading into darkness, the way the forest had welcomed him, the way the earth had opened to receive him. He would tell me that I deserved the same, that my curiosity was a crime, that finding him had created a bond between us that could only be broken by my own death. He would say that I owed him, that the forest demanded balance, that one disturbed resting place required another to set things right. He would whisper about the pills I could take, the rope I could buy, the bridge I could jump from, the train I could step in front of. He knew my fears, my weaknesses, my darkest thoughts, and he used them like weapons, pressing against the cracks in my mind until I thought I might break. Probably just my imagination, I told myself during the day, when the sun was bright and the world was normal and the dreams felt distant and unreal. Probably just the trauma of finding a body, the shock of seeing death up close, the mind's way of processing something too terrible to understand. I read about it online, about how first responders and witnesses to violent death often experienced flashbacks and nightmares, about how the brain could create elaborate scenarios to help make sense of the senseless. I told myself that the talking was just my subconscious, that the anger was my own guilt at being alive when he was dead, that the suggestion of suicide was my own depression finding a voice in the mask of a dead stranger. All pretty disturbing at the time, but nothing supernatural, nothing real, nothing to be truly afraid of. But the dreams did not stop. They came night after night, week after week, month after month, each one more vivid than the last, each one leaving me more exhausted, more frightened, more convinced that something was wrong in a way that therapy and logic and daylight could not fix. I started sleeping with the lights on, then stopped sleeping altogether, surviving on caffeine and fear, my eyes hollow, my hands shaking, my mind fraying at the edges. I saw a doctor, got sleeping pills, but the pills only trapped me in the dreams longer, made them deeper, made it harder to wake up when he started talking. I saw a therapist, talked about trauma and grief and survivor's guilt, but the words felt hollow, felt like they were describing someone else's experience, not the thing that was happening to me every night in the dark. He still turns up in my dreams from time to time. It has been years now, and the nightly visits have faded to occasional appearances, like a relative who only shows up at holidays to remind you why you moved away. But when he comes with the same intensity, the same anger, the same wet, gurgling voice that describes death like a gift he wants to share. I will be dreaming about something normal, something happy, a beach vacation, or a dinner with friends, or a walk through a sunlit meadow. And then the light will shift, the colors will darken, and I will smell that sweet smell, that terrible sweetness of decay, and I will know he is there. The clearing will appear around me, the fallen log, the body sitting up and staring, and the talking will begin again. The accusations, the demands, the whispered suggestions that I end my life and join him in the dark where I belong. No doubt he will be tonight after typing this. That is the thing about him, the thing I have learned over these years of occasional visits and constant fear. He feeds on attention, on memory, on the act of bringing him into the light even for a moment. Talking about him makes him stronger, makes the connection between us pulse with renewed energy, makes the dreams more likely, more vivid, more terrible. I know this, and yet I am telling you anyway, because the weight of keeping it inside is sometimes worse than the fear of what he will do when I sleep. Because there is a part of me, a dark and broken part that wants to understand, that wants to know why he chose me, why he will not let me go, what I did to deserve this haunting that has no name and no cure. I think about him often, more than I want to, more than is healthy. I think about the clearing in the woods, about the sweet smell that led me there, about the curiosity that killed something inside me that day. I wonder if he knew I was coming, if he left some trace, some scent, some psychic breadcrumb that only the nosy would follow. I wonder if he wanted to be found, if the loneliness of his death became too much even for him, if he reached out across the void and pulled me toward him like a fisherman reeling in a line. Or maybe he did not want to be found at all. Maybe my discovery was the violation that turned his peaceful decay into an angry haunting. Maybe he would have stayed quiet and gone if I had just walked past the smell and kept going. If I had been less curious, less nosy, less drawn to the things that should remain hidden. I do not go into the woods anymore. I cannot, not without smelling that sweetness in every breeze, not without seeing his swollen face in every shadow, not without feeling his eyes on my back as I walk. The forest that once brought me peace is now a place of terror, a maze of trees that all lead to the same clearing, the same log, the same body that sits up and talks in a voice like rotting honey. I stay in the city now, surrounded by concrete and noise, and the comforting absence of nature, but it does not help. He finds me in my dreams, finds me in the dark, finds me in the quiet moments when my guard is down and my mind is drifting. He is always there, waiting, patient in a way that only the dead can be patient, because time means nothing to him now, because he has forever to wear me down, to break my spirit, to convince me that the only way to end the dreams is to end myself. I do not know if I believe in ghosts. Not really, not in the way that people who see them clearly and speak to them calmly believe. I believe in trauma, in the power of the mind to create monsters from memory, in the way that guilt and fear can shape our dreams into prisons. But I also believe in the weight of his presence, in the cold that comes with him, in the smell that lingers in my nose for hours after I wake, in the words that feel too specific to be my own invention. I believe that something happened in that clearing, something that bound us together in a way I do not understand, something that gave him a doorway into my mind that he uses whenever he pleases. And I believe, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that he will never stop, never forgive, never rest, until I either join him in death or find a way to break the bond that my curiosity created. Tonight, after I finish typing this, I will go to bed. I will turn off the lights, because leaving them on does not help anymore, because he comes regardless of the brightness, because the darkness inside is worse than any darkness outside. I will close my eyes and I will wait, and somewhere, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the clearing that exists only in my mind, he will be waiting for me. His swollen face, his blackened eyes, his wet gurgling voice that smells of decay and sweetness and death. He will sit up and he will stare at me and he will talk, and I will listen, because I have no choice, because I am bound to him, because I disturbed his resting place and now he has claimed mine. No doubt he will be there. No doubt he will be angry. No doubt he will whisper the same terrible things, the same suggestions, the same demand that I end my life and lie down beside him in the dirt where the flies buzz and the maggots writhe and the forest slowly consumes what remains. And no doubt I will wake up screaming, as I always do, with the smell of him still in my nose and the sound of him still in my ears, and the terrible knowledge that tomorrow night, and the night after, and every night until I die, he will be waiting. Because some disturbances cannot be undone. Some resting places, once found, can never be left behind. And some dead men, once angered, will follow you through the dark forever, whispering their poison until the only peace you can imagine is the peace they found, alone in the woods, with the sweetness of decay as their only companion, and the silence of the forest as their only answer. Just recently, I was driving to Georgia on a week vacation, a road trip I had been planning for months, saving up my vacation days and mapping out the route like I was charting a course to some distant paradise. I had packed my car the night before, filling the trunk with a duffel bag of clothes, a cooler of snacks, and enough energy drinks to keep me awake through the long stretches of highway where the scenery never changes and the miles blur together into one endless ribbon of asphalt. The plan was simple. Drive through the night, avoid traffic, reach Georgia by sunrise, and spend the week exploring a state I had never visited before. I was excited, the kind of excitement that makes you feel invincible, that makes you forget that the world is full of dark corners, and that some of those corners hide things that want to hurt you. I left after dinner, timing my departure to hit the open road when most people were settling in for the evening. The first few hours were perfect, the highway stretching ahead of me like a promise, the radio playing songs I knew by heart, the headlights cutting through the darkness and revealing a world that felt like it belonged only to me. I passed through my home state and into the next, watching the mile markers tick down, feeling the freedom of movement, the illusion of control that comes from being behind the wheel of a car that responds to every touch. I stopped once for gas, once for coffee, and once to stretch my legs at a rest area that was bright and busy with families and truckers and the comforting hum of human activity. But the night wore on, and the stops became less frequent, and the highway grew emptier, and the world outside my windshield turned into something darker and more lonely than I had expected. At a rest stop in Tennessee around maybe 3 a.m, I decided to pull over. I had been driving for 6 hours straight, my eyes burning, my back aching, my mind starting to drift in that dangerous way that happens when fatigue sets in and the road becomes a hypnotic pattern of white lines and reflectors. I needed water, needed to splash my face, needed to walk around for 5 minutes and remind my body that it was still awake and alive. The rest stop was small, one of those forgotten places that exist between the bigger stations. A single building with a men's room and a women's room and a few vending machines that buzzed with fluorescent light. The parking lot was mostly empty, just my car and a few big rigs parked at the far end, their engines silent, their drivers presumably asleep in their cabs. The air was cool and damp, smelling of diesel and distant rain, and the silence was so complete that my footsteps echoed off the concrete as I walked toward the building. I was filling up my water bottle at the fountain outside the restrooms, the cold water spilling over my fingers and waking me up slightly, when I heard the door to the men's room open behind me. I did not turn around immediately. Rest stops are full of strangers coming and going, and I had learned long ago not to make eye contact with people at 3 a.m, not to invite conversation, not to acknowledge anyone more than necessary. I kept my eyes on the water bottle, watching it fill, listening to the footsteps that approached, and then stopped a few feet away. Then the footsteps retreated, the bathroom door opened again, and I thought nothing of it. Just another traveler, maybe a trucker, maybe a salesman, maybe anyone, using the facilities and moving on. But then he peeked his head out of the bathroom. I saw him in the corner of my eye, a large shape in the doorway, his face partially hidden by shadow, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He did not speak at first, just watched, his head tilted at an angle that seemed wrong, too still, too focused. I kept filling my bottle, pretending I had not noticed, pretending that my heart was not starting to race, pretending that the sudden silence from the bathroom doorway was not the loudest sound I had ever heard. Then he spoke, and his voice was not the voice of someone asking for directions or making small talk. It was the voice of someone giving an order, someone used to being obeyed, someone who did not expect to be refused. He aggressively insisted I meet him inside the bathroom. Those were his words, or something close to them, though the exact phrasing has blurred in my memory, overwritten by the adrenaline and the fear that followed. "Meet me inside," he said, "or come here, or get in here." Something that was not a request and not a suggestion, but a demand, delivered with a force that made me freeze. My hand still holding the water bottle under the running fountain, I turned my head slowly, my neck stiff, my mind racing through possibilities, explanations, ways to make this into something normal. Maybe he needed help, I thought. Maybe he had seen something. A leak, a fire, a person in distress. Maybe he was a security guard, though he wore no uniform, carried no badge, gave no indication of authority beyond the sheer size of him and the aggression in his voice. He was a big guy, probably a trucker, though I never got a good enough look at his clothes or his vehicle to be sure. He filled the doorway, his shoulders broad, his arms thick, his presence blocking out the light from inside the bathroom and casting a shadow that seemed to stretch toward me like a hand. His face was hard to read in the dim light, but I could see enough to know that he was not smiling, not friendly, not the kind of person you wanted to follow into a small windowless room at 3 a.m. in an empty rest stop in the middle of Tennessee. His eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, demanding, and there was something in them that I had seen before in movies and documentaries, something that predators have when they have spotted their prey and are moving in for the kill. At that very moment, my mom came out of the women's bathroom. I had not even known she was there, had not seen her car, had not heard her voice. She had been traveling separately, meeting me at this rest stop by coincidence or by some instinct that mothers have, some invisible thread that pulls them toward their children when danger is near. She stepped out into the fluorescent light, her face tired, her hair messy from sleep, and she saw me standing there with the water bottle in my hand and the big man in the bathroom doorway, and something in my posture that told her everything she needed to know. She called my name, her voice sharp with concern, and the sound of her voice broke the spell that had been holding me in place. I then proceeded to insist we get the fuck out of there immediately. The words came out of my mouth in a rush, high and panicked, not the voice I recognized as my own. I grabbed my mom's arm, my fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and I pulled her toward the parking lot, not looking back, not waiting for her to ask questions, not caring about the water bottle I left running at the fountain. I moved on pure instinct, the kind of instinct that animals have when they sense a trap, the kind that bypasses thought and goes straight to action. My mom, bless her, did not argue. She must have seen something in my face, some terror that she had never seen before, because she ran with me, her hand finding mine, her feet keeping pace with mine as we sprinted across the empty parking lot to where my car sat waiting. The guy slipped back into the men's bathroom when I said hi to my mom. That was the last thing I saw before I turned away, a flash of movement in the doorway. His large frame retreating into the darkness of the restroom, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click that sounded like a lock engaging. He did not follow us. He did not shout. He did not try to explain or apologize or pretend it had all been a misunderstanding. He just disappeared, back into the bathroom, back into the shadows, back into whatever plan he had been hatching before my mom's appearance ruined it. And that silence, that retreat, was somehow worse than any pursuit would have been. because it meant he had been hiding something, meant he had something to hide, meant that whatever he had wanted from me was something that could not survive the light of another person's presence. No telling what was going to happen. That is the thought that has kept me awake on countless nights since that rest stop. The thought that circles my mind like a vulture whenever I find myself alone in a dark place. The thought that makes me check my back seat before getting into my car and lock my doors the moment I sit down. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times, trying to imagine the scenarios, trying to map out the alternate timelines where my mom did not appear, where I followed him into that bathroom, where the door closed behind me and the fluorescent light flickered and went dark. I see his hands reaching for me, his weight pressing me against the cold tile, his voice whispering things that I do not want to hear. I see the bathroom stall doors, the ones that lock from the inside, the ones that no one would think to check for hours, maybe days. I see my car sitting in the parking lot, abandoned, my phone left on the passenger seat, my family wondering why I never arrived in Georgia, why I never called, why I vanished from the face of the earth without a trace. A friend said that guy was 100% probably going to rape me. She said it casually, over coffee, after I finally worked up the courage to tell someone what had happened. She did not say it to scare me, did not say it for dramatic effect, did not say it because she thought I needed to hear it. She said it because it was obvious, because anyone who had heard the story would come to the same conclusion, because the facts were so clear and so terrible that there was no other reasonable interpretation. A big man, alone at a rest stop at 3 a.m, aggressively insisting that a young person follow him into an isolated bathroom, retreating only when another adult appeared. The math was simple, the equation brutal, the answer one that made me want to vomit into my coffee cup. She was right, and I knew she was right, and the knowing made everything worse. I proceeded to floor it down the highway, my foot pressing the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring, the speedometer climbing past 70, past 80, past 90, the world outside becoming a blur of darkness and road signs, and the occasional glow of distant towns. My mom followed in her own car, her headlights visible in my rearview mirror, a comfort and a tether to something sane in a world that had suddenly revealed its teeth. I was ultra-paranoid for the next hour, my eyes darting to every mirror, every shadow, every vehicle that appeared behind me. I kept expecting to see his truck, some big rig with its high beams blazing, chasing me down the highway like a scene from a horror movie. I kept expecting to hear the crunch of metal as he rammed my bumper, to feel the car spin out of control, to see his face at my window, his hands reaching for the door handle, his voice demanding that I get out, that I come with him, that I finish what we had started at that rest stop. I thought about the movie Jeepers Creepers, that good movie, but fuck Victor Salva, as my friend had said, referencing the director whose own history of violence made the film's Predator all the more unsettling. In the movie, the creature chases the protagonists down the highway, relentless, unstoppable, appearing in the rearview mirror no matter how fast they drive or how far they go. That was how I felt in that hour of flight. My foot never lifting from the gas, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure terror. Every time a truck passed me, every time headlights appeared in my mirror, every time the road curved and the darkness seemed to reach out for my car, I was sure it was him, sure he had found me, sure he was coming, sure that the bathroom was just the beginning and the highway was where it would end. But he did not chase me. He did not appear in my mirror, did not ram my car, did not materialize from the shadows like some movie monster. The highway stretched on, empty and endless, and gradually my mom's headlights grew closer, and gradually my breathing slowed, and gradually the terror receded into something quieter, something that lived in my chest like a second heartbeat, always present, always waiting, but no longer screaming. I pulled over at the next well-lit gas station, a big chain place with cameras and clerks and the comforting buzz of fluorescent light, and I hugged my mom so hard she gasped. We did not talk about what had happened. Not then, not in the harsh light of the gas station with its coffee machines and its lottery tickets and its normalcy that felt like a foreign country. We just held each other, two people who had almost lost something precious. And then we got back in our cars and drove the rest of the way to Georgia in silence, each of us alone with our thoughts, each of us grateful for the miles that separated us from that rest stop and the man in the bathroom doorway. The rest of the trip went by fine. Georgia was beautiful. The vacation was everything I had hoped for. The days filled with sunshine and laughter and the kind of memories that are supposed to last a lifetime. I walked through historic districts and ate southern food and took photos of old buildings and blooming gardens, and I looked like a tourist, acted like a tourist, felt like a tourist. But underneath it all, in the spaces between the smiles and the sightseeing, the rest stop was always there. In the bathroom of every restaurant, I checked the stalls before entering, my body tense, my eyes scanning for big men in doorways. In every parking lot, I parked near the entrance, near the light, near other cars, never alone, never vulnerable, never exposed. In every hotel room, I wedged a chair under the doorknob and slept with the lights on. My dreams filled with bathroom tiles and fluorescent flickers, and a voice that insisted I come inside. That still creeps me out, to be honest. It has been months since that night, and I still think about it every day, still feel the ghost of his hand on my shoulder, still hear his voice in the quiet moments before sleep. I have told the story to a few people, my mom, my friend, a therapist who listens without judgment and asks questions I do not know how to answer. They all say the same thing, that I was lucky, that my mom's appearance was a miracle, that nothing happened and that is what matters. And they are right, in the logical part of my brain, in the part that understands statistics and probability, and the fact that most rest stops are safe, most strangers are harmless, most nights end without incident. But the other part of my brain, the older part, the part that evolved in caves and forests where predators were real and constant, that part knows better. That part knows what I saw in his eyes, knows what I heard in his voice, knows that the only difference between my story and the stories on the news is timing, is luck, is the appearance of my mom at exactly the right moment. I still drive, still take road trips, still stop at rest areas when I need to. I refuse to let him win, refuse to let fear shrink my world, refuse to become someone who sees danger in every shadow. But I am different now, in ways that are small and subtle, but deeply rooted. I never go into a public restroom without checking who else is there. I never stand at a water fountain with my back to a doorway. I never ignore the feeling in my gut that tells me something is wrong, that tells me to run, that tells me to get the fuck out of there immediately. I carry pepper spray on my keychain, a small thing that probably would not stop a big man like him, but that makes me feel slightly less helpless. I text my location to my mom whenever I stop, a habit that would have seemed paranoid before, but now feels like basic survival. And I think about him, the big guy, probably a trucker, who peeked his head out of that bathroom and demanded that I follow him into the dark. I wonder who he is, where he came from, where he went after I ran. I wonder if he is still out there, still driving the highways, still stopping at rest areas in the middle of the night, still looking for someone alone, someone vulnerable, someone who will not have a mom appear at exactly the right moment to save them. I wonder how many times he has done it before, how many times he has succeeded, how many people have followed him into that bathroom and never come out the same, or never come out at all. I wonder if the police ever found him, if anyone else reported him, if there is a file somewhere with his description and his method and the growing list of his victims. But thank God, nothing happened. That is the mantra I repeat to myself when the memories get too heavy, when the fear becomes too loud, when the what-ifs start circling like vultures. Thank God my mom was there. Thank God she came out when she did. Thank God I listened to my instincts and ran instead of staying, instead of being polite, instead of convincing myself that I was overreacting, that he was probably harmless, that the world was not as dangerous as it sometimes seems. Thank God for the miles that separated us, for the speed of my car, for the highway that carried me away from that rest stop and that man and whatever darkness he carried inside him. Thank God for the rest of the trip, for the sunshine, for the vacation that could have been ruined but was not, for the life that could have been stolen but was spared. But the gratitude does not erase the fear. The gratitude does not stop the dreams, does not silence the voice, does not dim the memory of his eyes in that bathroom doorway, fixed on me with a hunger that I recognized even if I could not name it. I am grateful, truly, deeply, with every fiber of my being. But I am also changed, marked, touched by something that I did not invite and cannot undo. Every time I walk into a public restroom, every time I see a big man in a truck stop, every time the clock strikes 3 a.m. and I am alone in the dark, I am back at that rest stop in Tennessee, filling my water bottle, hearing the bathroom door open, feeling his eyes on my back, and I am running again, always running, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the moment when the gratitude runs out and the darkness finally catches up. I do not know his name. I do not know if he was really a trucker or just someone passing through, a predator who happened to stop at the same rest area as me, who saw an opportunity and took it. I do not know if he remembers me, if he thinks about that night, if he curses my mom for ruining his plan, or if he simply moved on to the next rest stop, the next victim, the next bathroom doorway where he could stand and wait and insist. What I do know is that he is out there somewhere in the vast network of highways and rest stops and dark corners that crisscross this country like veins. I know that the world is full of people like him, people who look normal, who drive trucks or sell insurance or fix cars, who hide their hunger behind ordinary faces and wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. And I know that the only thing standing between us and them, between the life we have and the life they want to take, is sometimes nothing more than luck, timing, and the appearance of a mom at exactly the right moment. So I keep driving, I keep living, I keep filling up my water bottle at rest stop fountains, though now I do it quickly, with my back to the wall, with one eye on every door. I keep taking vacations and making memories and pretending that the world is safe enough to explore, but I never forget. I never let my guard down completely, and I never, ever follow anyone into a dark room, no matter how aggressively they insist, no matter how normal they seem, no matter how much my politeness screams at me to be nice, to be helpful, to not make a scene. Because I have seen what waits in the dark. I have looked into the eyes of someone who wanted to hurt me, and I have run and I have survived. And that survival is the only trophy I need, the only victory that matters, the only proof that sometimes, in the face of the worst the world has to offer, the instinct to flee is the bravest thing you can do. My grandfather's company, which does timber and mining, was setting up an office in a relatively remote part of a third world country, a place where the roads turned to mud when it rained, and the nearest city was a full day's drive through jungle and mountain passes. The company had been operating in the region for years, extracting resources from land that the locals had lived on for generations, building infrastructure where none had existed before, bringing modern industry to places that still relied on ancient traditions and beliefs that my grandfather and his employees dismissed as primitive superstition. They needed a local office, a base of operations where managers could coordinate shipments and handle paperwork and maintain the thin thread of communication that connected this remote outpost to the corporate headquarters thousands of miles away. They found a house that was dirt cheap, even for third world country standards. In a region where land was already inexpensive by Western measures, where a month's salary in America could buy a year's worth of living expenses, this house stood out for how little it cost. It was a large building, 2 stories of crumbling brick and rotting wood, with a tin roof that rattled when the wind blew and windows that had lost their glass decades ago, replaced by sheets of plastic that flapped like flags. The property included several acres of overgrown land, a well that still produced water, and a generator shed that had seen better days. For the price, it should have been snapped up immediately, developed into something profitable, turned into the kind of asset that companies like my grandfather's dream of finding. But it had sat empty for years, growing more decrepit with each season, avoided by everyone who knew the area, whispered about in the markets and the villages, a place that even the poorest families would not touch. Obviously, there was a catch. The villagers in that area told him not to purchase it, came to the company representatives with a delegation of elders and spiritual leaders, speaking through translators with an urgency that bordered on desperation. They said the house was haunted, that it had been haunted for as long as anyone could remember, that the land it stood on was cursed by something older than the village itself. They said everyone who had ever lived there died violently, every single family, every single occupant, going back generations to a time before written records, before the colonizers came, before the modern world had touched this corner of the earth. They spoke of previous owners found in pieces, of children who vanished and were never seen again, of grown men who walked into the house healthy and strong and were carried out days later, their minds broken, their bodies damaged in ways that no accident could explain. They begged my grandfather's people to find another location, to leave the house alone, to let the spirits keep what was theirs. My grandfather decided it was just some superstitious nonsense. He was a practical man, a self-made businessman who had built his company from nothing, who had faced down corrupt officials and hostile competitors and dangerous working conditions in some of the most inhospitable places on earth. He did not believe in ghosts, did not believe in curses, did not believe that a building could be inherently evil. He saw the cheap price, saw the strategic location, saw the potential for profit where others saw only fear. He told the villagers thank you for your concern, offered them a small payment for their trouble, and bought the house outright. He had it cleaned up, had the roof patched, and the windows replaced, and the generator repaired, and he assigned one of his most trusted employees to set up the office on the lower floor while living with his family on the top floor. It was a perfect arrangement, efficient and cost-effective, exactly the kind of solution my grandfather prided himself on finding. The guy setting up the office was a man named Henderson, though that was not his real name, just the one I will use to protect the identity of his surviving relatives. He was in his early 40s, competent and reliable, the kind of employee who had been with the company for 15 years and had never complained about an assignment, no matter how difficult or remote. He moved in with his wife and 3 kids, a daughter who was 12 and 2 sons who were 9 and 6. They were a happy family, or they appeared happy in the photos that were taken before they left, standing in front of their new home with smiles that looked strained even then, though no one noticed at the time. The wife had been nervous about the move, about taking her children to a foreign country, about living in a house that the locals refused to enter. But Henderson had reassured her, had told her the stories were just superstition, had promised her that they would be safe and comfortable, and that the assignment would only last a year before they could return home. My grandfather suddenly got no news from him for the longest time. The first week, Henderson had sent regular updates, emails about the office setup, phone calls about the local contractors, reports about the progress they were making. Then the communications became less frequent, every few days instead of every day, then once a week, then nothing at all. Since this was in a remote part of a third world country, my grandfather was not too worried at first. He just assumed they lost power or something, that the generator had failed, that the phone lines were down, that the internet connection had been interrupted by weather or technical issues. These things happened all the time in places like that, and he had learned not to panic over every delayed message. He waited, expecting Henderson to check in eventually, expecting the silence to break with a flood of accumulated news and excuses for the delay. But the silence stretched on. 2 weeks became 3, became a month, became 6 weeks with no word, no email, no phone call, no sign that Henderson or his family still existed. My grandfather started to feel uneasy, a nagging worry that he could not shake, a sense that something had gone wrong in a way that power outages and technical difficulties could not explain. He tried calling the local phone number himself, let it ring 50 times with no answer. He sent emails that bounced back undelivered. He contacted the local contractors who had been working with Henderson, and they reported that no one had seen the family in weeks, that the house had been dark and silent, that they had assumed the family had gone on vacation or returned home without telling anyone. The unease grew into fear, and the fear grew into action. He finally contacted the local police to go check on the guy, since he was completely unreachable. The police in that region were not known for their efficiency or their integrity. But my grandfather had connections, had paid enough bribes over the years to ensure that his requests were taken seriously. A squad of officers drove out to the house, a journey that took most of a day on roads that were barely passable, through jungle so dense that the sunlight barely reached the ground. They found the house locked from the inside, the generator silent, the windows dark. They had to break down the door using a heavy log as a battering ram, and when they finally gained entry, the smell hit them first. A sweetness so thick and cloying that several officers vomited before they made it past the threshold. They found everyone dead. The report that came back to my grandfather was fragmented, confused, delivered by a police captain who sounded shaken in a way that suggested he had seen things that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Apparently, the guy killed his wife, his kids, and then himself with a machete. Yes, not a gun. A fucking machete. In a country where firearms were easy to obtain, where a simple bribe could get you almost any weapon you wanted, Henderson had chosen a blade, a long curved machete of the type used to clear jungle undergrowth, the kind of tool that required proximity and effort and a level of physical commitment that a gun simply does not demand. He actually hacked himself to death. It was not one of those clean cuts on the wrists to let everyone slowly bleed out in a bathtub, not a mercy killing or a peaceful exit. Everyone was hacked down, including the guy himself, with a violence that spoke of rage and desperation and something else, something that the police could not name, but that they felt in the air of that house like a pressure against their skin. The description of the scene had to be an exaggeration, at least in part. I am assuming the sight of 5 decapitated bodies, including 3 children, was scary enough to make people see things that were not there, to invent details that helped them process the horror, to fill in gaps with supernatural explanations when the human ones were too terrible to accept. I heard fragments of what was found, whispered accounts from people who claimed to have seen the police reports, rumors that spread through the company like a disease. There were details that people could not have witnessed, details that changed with each telling, details that grew more elaborate and more impossible with every iteration. I stopped paying attention after I heard the phrase "magic machete" spoken by one of the local officers with a seriousness that suggested he genuinely believed the weapon had been possessed, that it had moved with a will of its own, that Henderson had been merely a vessel for something older and hungrier than any human rage. I was told the entire room was covered in blood, including the ceiling. This was the detail that stuck with me, that I could not shake, that appeared in my dreams for months after I heard the story. The blood on the walls made sense. The blood on the floor made sense. The blood on the furniture and the clothes and the bodies made sense. But the ceiling, that was something else. Blood does not naturally reach the ceiling, not without tremendous force, not without something flinging it upward with a violence that defies gravity. Some people were saying the blood on the ceiling had to have gotten there because the spirits threw the bodies around, that invisible hands had lifted the corpses and slammed them against the walls and the floor and the ceiling with a strength that no living person could possess. I had to explain about blood pressure, about how a severed artery can spray blood meters into the air, about how the human heart, even in death, can pump with enough force to create patterns that look impossible. I got tons of weird looks for my scientific explanation. Looks that said I did not understand, that I was missing the point, that the blood on the ceiling was not a puzzle to be solved, but a message to be read. Now, the weird part, if this is not weird enough, was that he managed to barricade the door with the bed, with his wife and kids on it. The bedroom door, the one that led to the master's suite where the family had been found, had been blocked from the inside by a massive wooden bed frame. One of those gigantic old beds that had come with the house, built in a time when furniture was made to last generations. Extremely heavy, extremely solid, the kind of thing that normally required 3 or 4 grown men to move even a few inches. And it was not just pushed against the door. It was wedged, jammed, positioned with a precision that suggested deliberate intent, a barricade designed to keep something out, or to keep something in. But the bodies were on the bed, all 5 of them, the wife and the 3 children and Henderson himself, arranged in a way that suggested they had been placed there after death, or had died there together, or had somehow been killed while the bed was already blocking the door. The locals say this is evidence he was possessed by spirits. They point to the barricade as proof that something beyond human strength had been at work, that no man, no matter how desperate or deranged, could have moved that bed while in the process of murdering his entire family and then himself. They speak of the spirits of the house, the ones that the villagers had warned about, the ones that had killed every previous occupant in violent and inexplicable ways. They say the spirits entered Henderson, filled him with their rage, used his hands to wield the machete, used his strength to move the bed, used his body as a tool to continue their cycle of death. They say the barricade was not Henderson's doing, but the spirits, a way to seal the room, to contain the violence, to mark the space as theirs. I say moving to the middle of nowhere in some third world country drove the guy nuts, and crazy people can do all sorts of crazy shit and even perform crazy feats of strength. I have read about mothers lifting cars to save their babies, about soldiers continuing to fight with mortal wounds, about ordinary people accomplishing impossible physical acts when their minds are pushed beyond normal limits by stress or fear or madness. The isolation, the heat, the unfamiliar environment, the pressure of the assignment, the whispers of the locals about the haunted house, the gradual breakdown of his wife's mental health as she became more frightened and more withdrawn. All of these things could have pushed Henderson over an edge that he did not know he had. The human mind is capable of terrible things when broken, and the human body is capable of terrible feats when driven by a mind that has stopped caring about limits. But even I have to admit, the barricade bothers me. The logistics of it, the timing, the sheer physical impossibility of killing 5 people with a machete, including yourself, and then moving a bed that heavy into position. The police report suggested that the killings had happened over several hours, not minutes, that there was evidence of movement between the bodies, of the bed being repositioned, of blood trails that did not match a simple sequence of events. They found the machete embedded in Henderson's own neck, the blade buried so deep that it had lodged in the vertebrae, requiring tremendous force to achieve. They found his wife's body on top of the children, as if she had tried to shield them, but the wounds on her back suggested she had been struck from above, from a standing position, while she lay on the bed. They found the children's bodies arranged in a row, their hands touching, their faces turned toward the ceiling, their expressions frozen in something that might have been sleep, if not for the gaping wounds that had nearly separated their heads from their bodies. Anyway, my grandfather had to pay a few bribes to make sure nothing gets to the press about the entire thing. Not hard, in the middle of nowhere, where journalists were scarce and the local authorities were more interested in cash than in transparency. He needed to protect the company's reputation, needed to prevent the story from reaching international news, needed to keep the investors calm and the stock price stable. The police were cooperative, eager to take money in exchange for silence, eager to classify the deaths in a way that would not require further investigation or explanation. They classified the deaths as natural, a term so absurd that it would have been laughable if not for the horror it was meant to cover. No idea how they will explain that. 5 people hacked to death with a machete, their bodies arranged in a barricaded room, their blood on the ceiling. But third world countries are awesome in their own terrible way, and paperwork can say whatever you pay it to say. All employees in the know had to sign an NDA too. My grandfather was thorough, was ruthless, was determined to bury this story so deep that it would never surface. He called a meeting of the senior staff, explained the situation in the vaguest possible terms, and presented them with legal documents that forbade them from discussing what had happened with anyone, ever, under penalty of immediate termination and financial ruin. Most signed without reading, trusting in the company, trusting in my grandfather, not wanting to know the details that might haunt them. A few asked questions, expressed concerns, whispered about the house and its history, and the warnings they had heard from the locals. My grandfather cut them off, told them the matter was closed, told them Henderson had suffered a mental breakdown, told them the family was dead and nothing could bring them back, and the best thing everyone could do was move on. He then tried getting other volunteers to set up the office. He needed someone on the ground, someone to finish what Henderson had started, someone to justify the investment he had made in that cursed property. He put out the call to his employees, described the opportunity in glowing terms, emphasized the career advancement, the extra pay, the chance to prove themselves in a challenging environment. He did not mention the house's history, did not mention Henderson, did not mention the blood on the ceiling, or the barricaded door, or the magic machete. But word travels, even through NDAs, even through bribes, even through the careful walls that my grandfather tried to build. The employees knew. They knew something had happened, knew it was bad, knew that the previous occupant had died along with his entire family in ways that no one would describe. Even if they had not heard all the gory details because of my grandfather's gag order, everyone knew the previous guy died. The rumor mill ground on, producing fragments of truth mixed with speculation and fear, until the general understanding was clear. The house was dangerous. The house killed people. The house was not worth any amount of money or any promise of promotion. No one volunteered. My grandfather sat in his office, staring at the list of employees who had refused the assignment, feeling a frustration that bordered on panic. He had invested too much to walk away now, had too much pride to admit that the villagers might have been right, too much stubbornness to acknowledge that some places are not meant to be occupied by the living. He promoted one guy, gave him a fancy title, and told him he was in charge of setting up that office. The man's name was Patel, another longtime employee, someone my grandfather thought he could count on, someone who had always been reliable, always said yes, always done what was asked without complaint. My grandfather called him into the office, offered him a raise, a new title, a fast track to senior management. He described the assignment as a temporary challenge, a chance to prove himself, a stepping stone to bigger and better things. He did not mention the house directly, did not mention Henderson, did not mention the blood or the machete or the barricade. But Patel knew. Everyone knew. And Patel, for all his years of loyalty, for all his history of saying yes, looked my grandfather in the eye and said no. The guy quit. He walked out of the office, cleaned out his desk, and never came back. My grandfather tried to stop him, tried to threaten him, tried to remind him of the contract he had signed and the consequences of breaking it. But Patel was done. He said he had a family, said he had children, said he was not going to end up like Henderson, hacked to pieces in a room with blood on the ceiling and a bed blocking the door. He said he did not care about the promotion, did not care about the money, did not care about my grandfather's company or his pride or his refusal to believe in things that could not be explained by spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He said some places are not meant for people, some warnings should be heeded. Some prices are too high no matter how cheap the property seems. And then he left, and my grandfather was alone in his office, with his maps and his plans and his house that no one would enter. I think about that house sometimes, when I am alone at night and the darkness presses close. I think about Henderson and his wife and his 3 children, about the last moments in that barricaded room, about the machete rising and falling, about the bed being moved into position, about the blood reaching the ceiling in patterns that no one can explain. I think about my grandfather, still stubborn, still refusing to believe, still sitting on a property that bleeds and waits and calls out to anyone foolish enough to listen. I think about the villagers who tried to warn him, who saw this coming, who understood something about that land that modern minds have forgotten how to know. And I think about the next person who will eventually say yes, who will need the money badly enough, who will be desperate enough or brave enough or stupid enough to walk through that door and climb those stairs and sleep in that room where 5 people died and a barricade was built from the inside by hands that may or may not have been entirely human. Because someone always says yes eventually. Someone always needs the job, needs the money, needs the escape from whatever worse thing they are running from. Someone always convinces themselves that the stories are just stories, that the locals are just superstitious, that a house is just a house, and blood is just blood, and a machete is just a tool. Someone always moves in, always ignores the warnings, always believes they will be the exception, the one who survives, the one who proves everyone wrong. And then the silence comes, the communications stop, the house sits dark and waiting until someone finally breaks down the door and finds what the darkness has made. The cycle continues, the house feeds, the blood dries and is cleaned and dries again. And my grandfather's company keeps looking for the next volunteer, the next promotion, the next person to sign on the dotted line and walk into a nightmare that began long before they were born and will continue long after they are gone. I do not know what is in that house. I do not know if it is spirits or madness or something else entirely, something that has no name in any language I speak. But I know that I will never go there, never set foot on that property, never volunteer for that promotion, no matter how fancy the title or how generous the pay. I have heard the stories, seen the fear in the eyes of people who know more than they can say, felt the weight of a truth that my grandfather's NDAs and bribes cannot fully suppress. And I know that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some houses, once entered, never let you leave. And some machetes, no matter how you explain the physics, move with a purpose that is not entirely human, cutting through flesh and bone and reason until nothing is left but blood on the ceiling and a silence that screams louder than any victim ever could.